Chapter 13. That evening, a silence not unlike the sepulchre quiet that follows a bombardment fell over Great Hall. Creatures flocked to the door of the infirmary, Sister Bethelle's sanctuary, demanding to see Muryet.
Muryet is recovering well, thank you,
she said to the Abbess and Skipper, creatures who must be treated with courtesy. To Friar Jerome, who had brought her food so that she need not leave Muryet's side.
She was not injured nearly so bad as I feared. Food. She is hardly in need of food. I've some herbs for her, and a tankard of water will suffice. For heaven's sake, leave me,
she said to the others. Cumely, the hogwife, who cared for the Dibbons, the wretched little squirrel-maid Marianne, and other abbey beasts.
A room full of shouting, yakking creatures will do her no good. Medicine and rest are the best things for her.
And once those hateful, clamoring visitor specters had receded, Sister Bethelle would return to the bedside, where she would sit and stroke the still unconscious little head, squeeze her paw for the 100th time to reassure herself that there was still a pulse. She would not leave the infirmary until her small patient woke, or until the pulse ceased. If she must feign politeness to that fat hedgehog friar, then so be it. Sister Bethelle gazed down at the paw that lay small and limp in hers. She shook her head.
It was his food, his accursed food, and the little oaf of a squirrel-maid that he keeps in his kitchens,
she murmured.
If she hadn't lugged that ridiculous tray of food up to the infirmary, the Abbess would never have complained about poor Muryet. I would never have been forced to allow her to leave this room. I told them all she was an invalid.
Later that night, Sister Jane appeared in the doorway of the infirmary, laden with prayer tomes.
I felt that you might be in need of these, Sister Bethelle. I will not intrude upon you. I understand that Muryet needs rest if she is to recover.
In spite of herself, Sister Bethelle felt abashed. Sister Jane had anticipated her reprimand. She gestured towards an empty bed. She tried to smile.
You are welcome here, Sister Jane. Set the books upon the bed. Thank you.
She watched as Sister Jane seated herself. It was then that she decided to set aside, for now, the barrier that she had erected between herself and the outside world.
Has anything happened, Sister Jane?
She swallowed hard.
Has Master Samuel spoken?
Sister Jane hesitated.
Sister Bethelle, regardless of what you may hear, you must not repeat any of it to any beast else,
she said softly.
Gossip is the last thing that this abbey needs today. Master Samuel took Muryet for a stroll in the woods. He says that he left her to lie down, and when he returned, she had apparently gone roaming. He found her in the midst of attacking vermin. She was ill and fainted suddenly, and a slingstone struck her afterwards. I can tell you nothing more.
This might have piqued the curiosity of any other creature, but Sister Bethelle only shook her head.
She should never have left the infirmary. I told them all she was an invalid.
Meanwhile, the Abbess and the Skipper, unable to sleep, sat alone in Great Hall.
I suspect that Sister Bethelle is lying, Skipper,
the Abbess said.
I feel almost certain that Muryet has not awoken. Now is not the time to undermine her, otherwise all of the Abbey will wish to follow suit.
Skipper nodded.
Aye, all Hellgates has broken loose.
He paused, and during the silence that followed, the Abbess did not chastise him.
I can't picture a pack of only 3 or 4 varmints, as he said, popping out of nowhere and rushing a little squirrel-maid and a single ferret over a chopping axe. Even if it were only a pawful of 'em, a creature armed with an axe and trying to look after a squirrel-maid wouldn't have stood a chance. He would have taken some sort of bad wound. But he said they wanted to take him down and leave him alive.
The Abbess sniffed.
Most likely nothing but a pack of common vagrants and robbers, if Samuel speaks the truth. They must have intended to probe him for food.
Perhaps, but unlikely, marm. What I'd like to know is, where are all these varmints coming from? When I first met that ferret, I told him my crew hadn't never seen any of them. Hadn't seen a vermin in seasons, for that matter. Not about this stretch. Now, if he's to be believed, there's 4 or 5 more varmints leapt out of nowhere and just happened to crash into him. Only 4 or 5. That ain't natural. If there's one thing I've learned about vermin, it's that they find strength in numbers.
If they've never been about here before... Supposing, Skipper, that Samuel spoke the truth. The creatures might have rushed him for food, but barbarians such as them most likely would have pursued him for blood alone if he had harmed them in self-defense. Which makes me wonder, why on earth did they not pursue him? Surely they couldn't have known that his flight would lead to the gates of Redwall.
That's assuming the ferret didn't tell him.
Skipper Jay smiled grimly.
I don't believe I've played a game since what happened to little Faintly, Mom. But this guessing game is far the hardest game I've played in all of my seasons. While we're on that question, we've got to wonder how he found his way to Redwall. Could have picked a map off a peddler or some such creature. And if that's the case, then these petty fiends might have done the same. They knew Redwall Abbey was near. They turned tail and fled rather than chase him here.
The Abbess hesitated.
I would be happiest believing that was true, Skipper, but I have an uncanny feeling that it is not.
She paused.
Let us imagine that the 4 vermin did not exist, and that Samuel harmed Muryet with the bread, then struck her with his dagger hilt or with any other hard object. Then he returned to the Abbey, bringing her along. What on earth would he want with her? And why wasn't Marianne harmed?
Early in the morning, Muryet awoke. It was difficult for her to open her eyes. Sleep had glued her eyelids together. The throbbing of her head did not improve matters, but she was smiling. Sister Bethelle's face was a blur, but there was nothing faint about the sound of her voice. It seemed so loud, so shrill. Muryet parted her lips, but found that the words refused to traverse through the rugged caverns of her throat. Water. Sister Bethelle had read this soundless plea upon the lips of many dying elders, and within moments she was holding a half-filled flask to the squirrel maid's mouth. Her paw, however, quaked so much that she came close to spilling it.
Praise God! Shall I inform the Abbess or the others? No, that may wait. They'll only flood the room with creatures and give the poor child a headache, which will finish her off. Come along, little one. Drink it up, and then I'll feed you some broth.
As she withdrew the empty flask, she was heard to mutter,
And by God, no oafs will convince me to send you out of this room until you've fully recovered.
Now Muryet spoke up, in her hoarse little voice.
I'll never leave the infirmary. Death is fine. I don't care for food. I saw faintly.
She closed her eyes and smiled.